Welcome everyone to the webinar, Unpaid Family Carers and COVID-19. What does self-care look like? I'd like to start by acknowledging that the land we are meeting on is the land of the Kaurna people, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to recognise the cultural authority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples whose lands you, the participants, are sitting upon. Their ties to the land, spirituality and culture remain strong. In the second day of National Reconciliation Week 2020, with its theme, In This Together, we are reminded that the reconciliation journey, like the COVID-19 battle, is something that we are all in together. 20 years ago, hundreds of thousands of people, black and white together, walked across bridges in Australia to show solidarity, respect and a hope for a better future and reconciliation. We keep building upon this history today. My name is Mark Waters. I'm the Executive Director of Palliative Care South Australia and your host for today. This webinar is the second of a two-part series focusing upon self-care. PCSA is thrilled to be working with Carers SA on this presentation today. It is both of our organisation's first foray into online webinar delivery, so we're trusting the technology to work for us. In terms of Palliative Care South Australia, our vision is all South Australians facing death and bereavement are supported to live, die and grieve well. PCSA endorsed a new strategic plan 2020 to 2022 in March this year, with a focus upon leadership as a peak body, community engagement, education and advocacy. We are seeking to grow conversations about death and dying across the community and improve and expand the services provided for palliative care. We really want people to understand all the dimensions of palliative care, especially as we're in National Palliative Care Week this week with its theme, Palliative Care, It's More Than You Think. We've targeted today's webinar at self-care for family carers during the COVID-19 pandemic. The messages will be equally relevant for service providers. It is a timely reminder that we all need to be looking out for others as well as ourselves, particularly where family carers are experiencing additional stress and strain. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on our respective websites as soon as possible. And there'll be opportunities to ask questions during the presentation, so the presenters are happy for you to use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen to ask questions, and we'll respond to them as we can. The presenters, David Millets is the CEO of Carers SA and has been in that role for the past 3 years. He has guided the organisation through the recent federal government reforms, which have changed the sector dramatically. David is passionate about the well-being of the wider community and ensuring that carers are recognised for their contribution in keeping our community afloat and reducing the impact on mainstream and non-government services. Sue Tucker is a qualified social worker and has worked in a range of both clinical and management roles in a variety of sectors, including the Department of Health and Community Health and Services, and more recently, Carers SA. Through her work within community health, Sue has had the privilege of working with nursing and allied health staff within the palliative care services at Victor Harbour, and believes strongly in the importance of empowering and supporting families through their palliative care journey within community. Sue has worked with Carers SA for the last 3.5 years as a team leader in the Southern Fleurieu region. She has a huge respect for the work and support family carers provide to loved ones and has a keen interest in ensuring the needs of carers are also acknowledged and addressed and the voice of carers is heard. Libby Ferguson, our third presenter, is the Program Manager for the Carer Support Planning Program and has been employed with Carers SA for over 4 years. With 17 years experience in community services, Libby has been supporting carers and families through both community work and management roles. Libby recognises the importance of ensuring that a carer's needs are understood, so the carer and their loved ones are best supported, and that they are acknowledged that the caring role often impacts the carer's overall ability to practice self-care and manage overall well-being. So over to David. I think he starts the batting order, and David, Sue and Libby will run the program from here.
Well, thanks, Mark. Thanks for having all three of us. On behalf of Carers SA, it's a fantastic thing to start partnering with PCSA and to have this conversation about carers during Palliative Care Week. But we also really enjoy having conversations about carers and spreading the word about what unpaid family carers do, and the work or role that they play in supporting the community, which is pretty significant. So I might just start around a really quick moment around the definition of unpaid family carers, and I think that's quite topical at the moment. The word carer, or the term carer, is being used a lot in the media at the moment in community because of this the tragedy unfolding, or that has unfolded around Anne-Marie Smith. So I think for us, it's an opportunity to say that there is a difference between unpaid family carers and what we often refer to as paid care workers. And I think for us, it's a really important thing to focus on the role that unpaid family carers and what they do in the community. So I couldn't, not hijacking our conversation, but making sure that that's something that we always like to try and put out there. I'm going to give you a bit of a background and sort of set the scene for what Carers SA does and how we're doing it, and then Sue and Libby are going to take you into really to what our response has been to COVID-19, to the pandemic, and how we've supported carers in their self-care during a really, really difficult period. So some basic stats which are probably really important to understand, and that some of you may or may not know. There's approximately 250,000 carers in South Australia, and so on a national basis, when we start talking, so there's about 2.7 million carers across Australia, unpaid family carers. When we start talking about what carers do nationally, it's about 1.9 billion hours worth of care that they provide to their loved one, because those people we support and those unpaid family carers are generally caring for a family, friend or loved one, and that's what they do. If we were to replace those unpaid family carers, so what would that cost us? Well, there's some new figures being done right now, but in 2015, the replacement cost for those carers, unpaid family carers in Australia, is $60.3 billion. So it's a really significant contribution financially that unpaid family carers are making to our community. And I guess that's why we will often refer to the cohort that we support as a safety net for community, and it's one of the terms that we use quite often. And I guess why we do that, because if you took out that 60, or if you had to spend $60.3 billion to do the role that unpaid family carers are doing, then there'd be some systems crashing. So not only would there be some financial systems, would be some real difficulty. I said what you would also see is that if unpaid family carers weren't there, you'd also be seeing the load on government and other NGO systems really buckling even more than they are now. So you're thinking about health, mental health, aged care and disability. So the part that unpaid family carers play is vital in making sure community can operate and be relatively smooth. And I think that we know that it's vital for unpaid family carers, and I'll shorten it because we know the definition that we're talking about. It's vital for carers to understand self-care, to think about it, and to maintain their well-being for what can be under some pretty heavy caring loads, or loads in what they're doing. And I say it's vital for them to understand, and I think Sue and Libby may touch on this a bit later, but carers never think about themselves first. It's not in their nature. It's not what they do. So if ever we're having, and loads of examples, but if you're ever having a conversation with a carer, it's never about them. It's always about the person they care for, they love. And so they always come out of that conversation. So for us, that education component and that piece about making their well-being up front is really important, and that's what Sue and Libby will talk about how we've tried to do that during this period. And it's important to do that because the stats tell us that carers have a much lower health and well-being than those people who aren't in caring roles in the community. So it's really significant and a really significant difference. So that's part of our role, to try and get people to think about that and have carers have that front of mind, as much as they don't want to, because they're very selfless in what they do. I think that just some really quick background that Mark touched on around where we sit now in the support structure for carers across the country. In April 6th of this year, the federal government activated or went live with a new carer support model. It is something that has seen or will see at the end of May a transition period end into the brand new carer support model, which has gone from having over 80 organisations funded by the federal government across the country to provide support to carers, down to 10 organisations who are providing services across 16 geographic regions across Australia. So there's the change in the way that services are provided with regards to the number and breadth of organisations is massive. So over 18 down to 10 organisations. That was launched at a really not so opportune time, just as we were coming into the Covid-19, or we were in that Covid-19 pandemic, and things were changing really quickly. So South Australia, or Carers SA, we were really fortunate to pick up both geographic regions of support for carers in South Australia. And that's really simply split out aligning with the PHN regions, so Metropolitan Adelaide and Country South Australia. So they're the two regions. So we were fortunate enough to be able to secure the contracts with federal government to deliver those services, and we've done that in partnership with some consortia in a consortia. So we lead that consortia, and our consortia members, Skylight Mental Health, Life Without Barriers, Dementia Australia, and the MPY Women's Council. We have made a conscious decision to split out our consortium members into cohort-specific groups. So we know that we are excellent at, or believe over time, over our 30 years, we've become really, really good at providing services in general to carers. But we also acknowledge there's some specialists in the world. And so we know carers of people with mental illness often require specialist support, as do those with dementia, as do those with disability, which is where, and alcohol and other drugs, which is where Life Without Barriers are helping us and assisting. So, so that's the really quick version about how we have ended up, or where we are structured as an organisation. And I guess the new carer support model launched on April 6th, but then, almost as soon as that occurred, we started, social isolation measures started to come in. And we had to think about how we responded as an organisation, just like everyone else had, about how we continue to support carers. And our team moved really, really quickly in not only to get home, to be away from the office and to work from home, but how we would then react and support and have a response, support carers in what we would call a COVID-19 response. So look, it's at this point that I'll throw across to Sue then to talk to some detail about what we did and how we did it. And then Libby will follow on from that about how our COVID response links into the new carer support model and how the everyday operation of that works.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Yeah, as Dave said, you know, Carers SA, along with you know, every other agency, was faced with transitioning or changing services during that COVID period due to the social isolating restrictions that were placed on everybody. So, you know, we had to think about how we were actually going to connect with our carers, given that some of the services that we provide are face-to-face and happening in community, and we could no longer, you know, provide that. So the organisation started a process of contacting all of our registered carers by telephone. And the intention of those calls was to really check in with carers around, you know, what the impact of COVID was for them, touching base around what their current needs might be and what sort of changes that might fall out of the COVID restrictions, and identifying, I guess, where those changes needed to have some support services wrapped around them in order for the carers to maintain their caring role. So it was really a huge amount of consideration went around, you know, what was the intention of these phone calls, and how would we have those conversations with carers who, as Dave said before, are very good at not considering their own well-being, but you know, more comfortable often in talking about the person that they're caring for. So we know that carers are very resilient and incredibly resourceful and manage their caring roles often in really difficult circumstances. And so we were a little bit unsure about how a phone call seemingly out of the blue might be taken by carers. And overwhelmingly, people were really appreciative of that call. And I think that's a reflection on the importance of connection, you know, in these sorts of global crisis where people are forced to not actually have connection. To be able to have an opportunity to touch base was something that they really appreciated. So it was important for us to, when we were making those calls, because we know that carers move through their caring journey very differently. They all come with different skills and experiences and ways of coping, that we needed to make sure that this process was something that connected with carers at a place where they were at, so that we were going to be flexible in the way we had our conversations. We were going to be as flexible as we could be in the responses that we could provide to carers, and that we were very respectful of you know, the skill base that our carers have, so that we weren't making assumptions you know, around the level of support that they may or may not have needed. So these were really intentional conversations that we were having with carers about what their current situation was, and intentional around asking some questions or providing some information about self-care, which I guess maintained the focus on the carer rather than the person that they're caring for. So, you know, we know that carers fill their buckets up differently. You know, if it's not a one size fits all, and so for some people having a you know, a cup of tea in the backyard fills their bucket up, and for somebody else that might be gardening. So we're really conscious that there was going to be some really rich stories that we were going to hear, and that we needed to hold space for those conversations to happen so that carers felt listened to, that we were, respectful of their space, and that, they were able to be the holder of the information. We weren't making assumptions. So we set about making these telephone calls, and I think over a 7-week period, it was over 4,000 calls that we made. And the sorts of conversations that we were having were around, what carers were currently doing in this strange COVID landscape that we found ourselves in, and really just how they were managing that for themselves. And so we talked about self-care in terms of taking time out for yourself, being able to exercise, being able to eat healthily. We know that sleep is really important to somebody's overall well-being, and often our carers report that they don't get much sleep, or it's interrupted sleep, that the demands of their caring role are such that they don't have a routine often. We talked about things like how people actually relax, and what are those things that people do to take their mind away sometimes from their caring role and be very focused on something else that's an activity that's really for them, rather than management of a household or their caring role. What sort of social connections were carers still able to maintain, in this new landscape that we were in, and what sort of impact that change had for them. Because we know that there's many carers who have very limited supports, both from family and within community. And so we were aware that this COVID space was going to, in some ways, make that even more isolating. And so we were really keen to understand how people manage that for themselves. And often carers, when they're in that type of environment, I guess, get used to doing things by themselves, for the person that they're caring for. And so some of the people were saying to us, actually, this is no different to what my life is normally like, which, is interesting because it demonstrates carers' resilience, but on the other hand, just demonstrates how isolated some carers are on an ongoing basis, with or without this COVID time. So these conversations were really around, asking the carer to reflect on where they were at with those things. And as I say, everybody's... sorry, it's a call coming through on a technology, sorry. I knew that something was going to happen technology-wise, it's always me. So we knew that carers, were very varied in the way that they were going to respond to that. So our task in that space was really reinforcing those things that carers were doing for themselves, and where we needed to, I guess, gently broaden out that conversation around some suggestions that carers may or may not be able to incorporate into their repertoire already. The other part of these conversations were also looking at the support services that people, have wrapped around them, and what that might look like, and whether there needed to be some additional services that could potentially help support the carer in their role. And so we were able to, through these conversations, really pick up perhaps where some additional supports might have been useful for a carer, and have those discussions with them, and then do referrals back through to our planning team, which is Libby's team, who'll talk a little bit more about what they were able to achieve from those referrals. That real ability to be able to enhance the supports that wrap around carers. For some people, we discovered that you know, where we may not have had contact with them for some time, that their circumstances had changed quite significantly. And so these calls were actually an opportunity to pick that up, which we may not have otherwise have picked up, because carers are sometimes not always in a position to reach out, you know, for additional services. You know, they're very stoic and they'll do lots of things for themselves and not often ask for help. So that this sort of conversation by the telephone calls was a way in, I guess, to offer that without them needing to initiate the conversation. The other things that we picked up, you know, was that we had quite a number of people who were significantly impacted by the COVID pandemic that was happening at the time, and so we're really very emotionally distressed, and so we were able to link those people directly through to our counselling team, which, you know, if perhaps you know, we hadn't been making these calls, those people may not have received those services that they needed. So it was a real opportunity to be able to link people to not only our services, but a whole range of other services. Our team of service delivery facilitators, you know, had a repertoire of services that they could, you know, link people with, and it was a real opportunity to be able to support carers in that way. The other thing that we were able to offer partway through the process, we got some additional funding, was to offer carers some vouchers that could support some of those self-care strategies. So we were able to, through the conversations with carers, tease out, I guess, a little bit of where some of their concerns might have been, and provide some vouchers around that. So for an example, you know, if carers were really talking about the struggle around being able to purchase their groceries, then we were able to offer a voucher to help support, you know, their shopping. For carers who were already doing some self-care, you know, an example was, you know, when we had a lady who used to do knitting, that was her way of filling up her bucket. She would spend the evening knitting, but because of the COVID restrictions, couldn't go out, get more wool. So she was able to get a voucher, an online voucher, for her to be able to order some wool and have it delivered. So, you know, there was varying scenarios, I suppose, about how those vouchers could respond to people, enhance the wellbeing strategies that were, you know, they were already doing. You know, we had just so many interesting stories around, you know, people's caring roles. We had, you know, one lady who was able to buy some new shoes because, you know, her son that was living on the spectrum needed to go out and walk daily, and she didn't have exercise shoes, and so for that reason she wasn't going out with her son to do that physical activity. So for her, being able to go out, exercise for herself and feel like she was supporting her son by way of getting some new shoes, you know, was pretty good. So yeah, this wellbeing calls, I guess, was a process in touching base with carers, having those intentional conversations around self-care, encouraging carers where we could, providing vouchers where we could, provide the connection to other services that would wrap around and provide more intensive support. It was a real opportunity. And it was just it's been a really interesting, I guess, opportunity to hear the carer stories and to understand just, you know, how complex some of them are. And over that time, I guess we saw at the beginning carers voicing concerns about, you know, how this virus would move through the community and what that would mean for them in their role. and for the person that they're caring for. And so, as Dave said earlier, you know, many carers also have poor health outcomes or are living with disabilities themselves and are caring for people that have chronic illnesses or disabilities that really make them very compromised when something like, you know, COVID comes into our community. So we heard a lot of carers saying that, you know, they had cancelled support services that they had had previously because they were so fearful about what that would mean for them in their family home. And we had reports where some services were cancelling services. So, you know, carers were then required to really provide much more care than they had previously been doing. So the pressure was on. And then as we moved through that 7-week period, the stories kind of changed to ones of more, you know, hope and optimism that things were going to change and that we would all get through it. I guess a bit more exploration of carers in community and sort of reaching out to some of the services that they were involved with, you know, prior to the pandemic starting. So yeah, it's been a really interesting journey with carers, and I can only say that their resilience and resourcefulness through this period has just been really amazing. Yeah, I really take my hat off to carers. They don't often get a voice. You know, we often hear that carers, when other services are coming into their home, you know, can be quite dismissive of, you know, what carers have to contribute to the care conversations. And I think it's been just a really great opportunity for us to reach out to carers and to support them in what's a really vital, you know, role for our community. So, yeah. So I think I'll hand over to Libby now, who'll talk a little bit about the next sort of step in the process. So from where our service delivery facilitators identified that there was some more pressing, immediate, broader needs, then we were able to move carers through and connect them to Libby's team, who'll talk a little bit more about, you know, what the plan is for them.
Thank you, Sue. Beautifully said, by the way. I think one of the things, as Dave mentioned earlier, is we were about to take on this new model at the same time as the pandemic hit. But a part of that new model was looking at a different way of, I guess, introducing carers, you know, into their supports and looking at. It was called a carer star. So we were actually it was already starting where, instead of this being about the person that somebody cares for all the time, it was about them. So we were already starting to shift and have conversations with carers about them and what their role means for them and how that impacts their well-being and their mental health. So we were in a really good place, in a sense of the staff sort of within the planning team had already had a lot of experience and training, you know, using a model that was really perfect once COVID-19 came in, to be able to drill down a little bit further, and being able to then sort of put some plans in place where appropriate for a carer to be able to have reflect on, and I guess after the conversation kind of really unpack what it means for them as well. Another change within the new model was we have what's called carer-directed packages. So it allows a carer to have more flexibility in their own, you know, journey in terms of what it actually means for them as a carer and what would help them. So we're not looking at respite all the time now. We're actually having conversations. You know, we're respite in terms of a residential facility isn't something the carer wants to do, and we'll be able to unpack those conversations and look a little bit further about what's important to the carer to keep their mental health and well-being, and build their resilience and bring back their you know, their individuality as a person and their sense of self. As Sue was saying and David was saying, quite often we all hear the stories where a carer will talk about their caring role. They actually don't even talk about themselves. They're talking about the person they care for, and you're always bringing that back to, but what does it mean for you, and what does that look like for you? You know, so being able to kind of identify, you know, what is important for a carer to be able to be the best that they can be is, you know, really important. So we were already starting to use the tool. And we'd already changed our hours, so you know we're currently operating till 7 o'clock in the evening, giving flexibility. We looked at all the challenges and barriers that carers are faced with, and how we could be really adaptable in terms of responding. Once the wellbeing calls had happened, the team really had to move quite quickly then to sort of get through the flood of calls and assessments that were being taken place. So our calls had increased. So, you know, we're kind of averaging around 190 calls a week now, and that was, you know, also through the COVID period. And in the assessments that I'm talking about, we were doing about 130 to 140 we have booked in a week. So, you know, that is that opportunity for a carer to sort of talk a little bit more about what might be happening for them and where the challenges might be for them, and being able to sort of unpack and identify what's really important. I think the really some of the key things, and as Sue said, there's a lot of carers that would not have been identified or you know, picked up the phone and called us, but through these conversations, we've been able to sort of unpack things that I think a carer has maybe lived in that role for so long that it just became the norm, and they didn't even realise that, you know, actually this would benefit me and this would be really good for me. So it really gave us the opportunity to sort of work with carers and have those conversations and look at what supports are in place. One of the really good things that then happened is the packages that we are able to give a carer in terms of the, you know, suite of services that we can support a carer with the COVID-19 had become more flexible. So we were able to be really, really creative in some of the things that we could put in place for a carer that might have not ordinarily been able to happen. And I think some of the challenges that, you know, we were able to identify carers facing was, and Sue did highlight this as well, one of the common things for us was when supports in home had actually made that decision. Agencies and organisations had made the decision that it was no longer safe to have workers going into people's homes, and this had a huge impact on carers when they've got somebody coming in daily or every couple of days to sort of now feel quite isolated and alone. So in those instances, we were able to really cast a wide web and look at all the organisations and services that provide that in-home support, building relationships where there, you know, maybe not have been relationships previously, to be able to make sure that we were able to continue that service for the carer sort of within that time. Really common was, and especially with our elderly, really immune compromised was carers not wanting to go to the shop. They were so fearful of catching the virus and affecting the person that they care for, that this was a real significant point for them, because how else were they going to sort of be able to get food and do those things? So while the team that Sue was supervising was making those wellbeing calls and, you know, perhaps providing vouchers and stuff, when they were able to come through and do the carer star assessment and work with one of the planners, we were able to then put some of those services in a little bit more longer, and we were literally taking shopping lists over the phone, and sort of passing those on and making sure that somebody was to do their shopping and to bring the food in for them. And we kept those services continuing. And another thing, and this was a really big one, is we have lots of caregivers that provide care for young people with disability. So we had school restrictions, and all the schools had closed, and essentially we had lots of parents that already had a significant caring role that had now been increased tenfold. So, you know, some of those examples is, you know, I remember talking to a woman who had a child on the autism spectrum, and they had done so much work with that child in the school just to be able to get them to attend for half a day, and it was slowly increasing, and then suddenly she can't go to school anymore. So the carer trying to sort of manage the impact for her, she had to stop working, and she's suddenly a school teacher, and the little person, you know, behaviours could be quite challenging, and didn't understand why she can't go to school now. So we were able to sort of purchase some sensory items for the home, so, you know, she could make a space for the little person to be able to continue doing some of those things that was already put in place at school. Purchasing laptops was a really big one for us, and when carers were sort of ringing up going, we're isolated now, but we don't have a computer, we don't have a laptop, and being able to put those supports in place so the carer could try to normalise things as much as they can, and in essence then try to have some time for themselves while, you know, that young person might be doing something on the computer for school. And another one we had, which was a little bit challenging, was carers that had the person they care for, they might already be in residential care, and they were pulling them out and bringing them home because they were fearful of leaving them in residential care. The impact, you know, for that carer was that sometimes that's 24/7 care. So the need for services were really, really great, and services weren't yet available because it literally happened so quickly. We were able to sort of have those conversations and put some services in place really quickly while working with My Aged Care and the likes to try to get something a little bit longer term in place, and continuing to support the carer because they're doing it out of absolute pure love, but it comes at a really big cost, especially when that care is increased when the person is not in the home and they've now brought the person home and they don't realise the impact and the extent of that caring role. We also had, and Sue did sort of allude to this before as well, around the exercising and you know, lots of carers that could no longer leave the house. They couldn't go to the gym if they had a membership. They couldn't go walking with their friends. They couldn't do all of that stuff. So we were able to be really creative and purchase equipment, treadmills and you know, rowing machines and all sorts of things to be able to give that carer the opportunity to sort of maintain their mental health and well-being and recognise their importance, you know, within this time as well. So, and helping lots of people set up Zoom and things like that to be able to connect, you know, to their loved ones and their friends because of the impact of the social isolation and what that meant as well. Out of this, it also means that we have been able to put these plans in place with a lot of people that while we're looking at the now, you know, we were looking at the couple of months ahead of us. What it means is we will go back and touch base and do it all again, you know, in another couple of months to then look at, you know, we now know that this is dying down a little bit, but how do we ensure that that carers are being supported and their needs are being met now for the next 12 months. And, you know, possibly somewhere that we wouldn't have been with so many carers had Sue's team not sort of, you know, kind of brought them in with the calls that they were doing. We also in that time too have managed to connect with a lot of carers that have come from other organisations, and as they've said, because they were condensing down into one, we've had a lot of carers come through other organisations, and it's been a really good opportunity for carers that weren't supported by Carers SA, and didn't know who Carers SA were, didn't necessarily want to be registering with us because they didn't know, I guess, what that meant for them to be able to start building those relationships with staff as well, to know that we are here, that they can be connected, and that we are looking at those services, really holistically in terms of what that means for every individual. It's not a one size fits all, and we sort of wouldn't ever want to lead by any of that anyway. So that's what's been really, really important. We've also had a part of our counselling team. I think the last 6 weeks we've received 140 new carers into the counselling team. So those carers will receive initially 6 free sessions of counselling with a qualified counsellor. And what was really highlighted through the conversations that we were having in the planning team and unpacking the STAR was the social isolation and the greater impact that the caring role now had, because people found themselves literally 24/7 with somebody, and it was we noticed that impact wasn't sustainable, and they knew that wasn't sustainable. So we've been also able to put those services into place as well, which has been really, really important too. So I think it's been a really sort of collaborative opportunity that we've had, and we've had to work really quickly and be really creative. And as I say, I think we were building for this prediction of becoming really, really busy, and it happened sooner than we anticipated. But I know I can say for myself and the planning team, it's been an absolute privilege and a blessing to be able to support carers and hear their stories, and look at the amazing things that they're doing, and recognizing how incredibly tough it's been. So yeah, I know for myself, I feel really privileged to have been a part of that.
Thank you to Libby and also Sue and David. I'll summarise in a moment what I think I've heard, but if people do have any questions or comments, please use the Q&A chat on the bottom of the screen. Write your comments and we'll try to address them. David covered the definition of unpaid carers, the changes to funding and organisational arrangements that have occurred with Carers SA, and how then as an organisation you geared up for COVID-19 and put that response into the new carer support model. That must have been pretty complex. Sue outlined how Carers SA has been checking in with carers during the COVID-19 lockdown, and I was really impressed to hear that intentional conversations being held, that being able to make sure that people were really being listened to. Checking out with them whether things were escalating for carers because of the changed circumstances of the pandemic, and then how different carers could practice or were showing that they were practicing self-care. And Libby discussed how Carers SA has moved carers from the wellbeing calls into the new carer support system. And that was very touching in relation to the girl with on the autistic spectrum that obviously had just started to progress into school, and then that was cut off, and how you could adapt to provide some relevant activities and tasks at home for her. The question I've got, I suppose, during COVID-19, with the lockdown, a lot of telephone contacting has been occurring. We've got Red Cross checking in with the vulnerable, palliative care specialist teams are doing a lot more telehealth. How has the telephone work changed the nature of your service, and what elements of that do you think will stay beyond COVID-19? And where do you want to get back to face-to-face or more support or being able to provide groups where you can? Anyone or all three of you?
I might start to begin with. Look, the new model, the new care support model was really based initially around that assessment process that Libby talked about is a phone-based process. So so in some sense that hadn't changed the way we planned to deliver the service anyway. So I guess that that was an okay thing. It didn't require too much change. I think when we start to think about, I might let Sue and Libby talk about the impact of actually doing that and the difference between what Sue would be involved in normally, which would be a face-to-face service and how that looks and the difference between that engagement. What that looks like, so I won't answer that bit. With regards to transitioning back to the old world, I think there's probably a couple of things. One, that we're talking with the federal government, as I think most providers are with their funding body, or at least asking the question, and I know we're having detailed conversations about it with the Department of Social Services about what have we changed and what's become flexible that's actually really good and beneficial for carers. How do we keep those and not go back to potentially what might have been a more limiting structure of support that we could provide? So there's the thing I'm really encouraged with at both the state and federal government level, the conversations I've been involved in, they've been really willing to hear that. They've been really willing to hear what's worked well and how do we then potentially look to continue to provide that service. So we're in the midst of those conversations at the moment, and I think it's, when you have the CE of the Department of Human Services locally asking what's worked well, we need to consider not just moving everything back just because that's how we should, because that's how it was done. We need to consider what is good that we should keep. And I think that's a really positive sign both in state government and federal government that question is being asked. Listen, I think, and Libby and Sue might be able to answer more, but I think what we will do is we'll have a blend of services for a while. We still have, I know, carers that are saying that, we've got two groups of carers maybe, Sue. One that are saying, look, oh God, I can't wait to get back to face-to-face stuff. I just can't wait to do it. And others who are still really cautious. And so, yeah, Sue, maybe you can pick up on that next bit. So.
Yeah. That's one of the things that we discovered around making the calls was people's real interest to keep connecting in some way. So what we've established is some online groups, which previously in pre-COVID times we may not have actually considered doing, but because we're in the landscape that we're in, we thought let's try connecting carers in this sort of virtual space like we're doing today, and see how it goes. And for those carers obviously that have access to the technology, we know that's not going to be equitable for everybody, but for those people who do have capacity to do it, been really surprising how interested people have been in maintaining contact through that medium. And we've just started trialling the new model online, which was originally going to be delivered face to face, but we've started doing some of that content delivery online, and it's been really successful. So it's probably something maybe we might not have thought of if we weren't in this predicament that we're in. And for some carers that live remotely or have very demanding caring roles and have limited time, sometimes face-to-face services where you need to leave your home, maybe drive half an hour to wherever the group's being provided and get back, it's not doable. But something over a computer where it's just down the hallway, it makes it more accessible. So I think, as Dave said, we're sort of really keen to see how that rolls out, and and how successful that is, and feed that back to the department as maybe something that we can be providing in addition to our face-to-face services. But certainly we've got a lot of carers waiting for the end of lockdown so that they can, you know, be looking at people in the flesh. Yeah.
Libby, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, look, we had a similar experience with the counselling team, because that is primarily it's face-to-face counselling, and obviously when this happened, a lot of counsellors, even our brokered counsellors, kind of withdrew those face-to-face services, and it was all over the phone and over Skype. That's certainly what Care SSA has done as well with their in-house counsellors, made it that we still wanted to provide this service. So how do we overcome this barrier and try to still make sure in a time where it's really, really important that we can offer what we can offer. So it's worked really well, and it's essentially worked really well for people that ordinarily even wouldn't want to travel, and more often than not, though, people are really keen to sort of get back and really want to do the face-to-face stuff. So we've actually got a mix at the moment. So a lot of our counsellors that are in a broker, they are seen as an essential service. So they are already back doing those things face-to-face. And it at the moment is providing a carer with a choice in terms of if this is, you know, what is going to benefit them. So we're really lucky to be able to sort of offer that at the moment.
Fantastic. Well, we've come to the end of our session. Thank you very much once again to David Millets, Sue Tucker and Libby Ferguson. We've really valued the partnership between Palliative Care South Australia and Carers SA, and we want to keep working on that and building on it from here. Yesterday, Palliative Care Australia launched a resource called Self-Care Matters, and a question was asked as to whether this resource could be used with family carers, and it was thought to be very relevant there as well. It's got some simple self-assessment tasks and people able to work through a process to develop a self-care plan. So go to the Palliative Care Australia website to have a look at that. They also have the full hour-long launch of that program on their YouTube page, so you can have a look at that. We have been recording this session this afternoon, and so that will be available on our websites. We want you to continue to go well in National Palliative Care Week, as we do know that palliative care is more than you think, and particularly in its reaching out to families and family carers. Thank you for your participation.
Thanks for having us, Mark.